with my background as a trained scientist, I will be the first to cheerlead a lot of the benefits of technology, right? So on the one hand, nobody can disagree with or doubt that, in general terms, sort of capital T technology has had a huge positive impact in, human civilization, standards of living, all of this stuff, curing diseases, blah, 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 right? This is not arguable. On the other hand, it is also equally true that we, as a sort of species and then, societies as parts of that, have always had a difficult time figuring out how to incorporate new technology effectively and how to do so in ways that don't really disrupt or negatively impact our lives, right? And you can find examples of this all throughout history, but looking at the sort of mid-19th century Industrial Revolution and how European cities had no idea what to do about coal burning and the smog that took place, and they've now in the past several decades in London spent all of this time and money cleaning up the facades of all of these old buildings that were polluted by the impacts of the early industrial age. And so this is all a way of saying that we now have these devices in our pockets that are truly some of the most powerful double-edged swords in the sort of technological development of human history. And it has some very specific impacts for how we try to practice and how we try to go about music. The couple of books that you mentioned, I alluded to them in a recent post, and I haven't really written about it yet extensively, but I've noticed that there is a growing I would say sentiment and sort of train of thought among a lot of writers and academics and intellectuals, in the United States and then certainly worldwide too, of people who are looking at these early impacts of new technology and trying to figure out, like, what does this mean and what is this doing to us and what are the pros and what are the cons? And the specific book you mentioned, Digital Minimalism, by the author Cal Newport, it's one I read over the summer because I was really interested in this question. Because for myself, I had, throughout my own auditioning experience, I had beneficially incorporated a lot of technology for myself, which had the impact of amplifying my efforts. It made me more efficient. It made me able to do more in less time. It made my practicing better. It made my learning better. But I've also seen some really, really consequential downsides of this. And Cal Newport's book put as fine a point on it as really anyone has yet that I have read. And it's sort of obvious in retrospect, but the thing he stated very concisely was that the sort of new incarnation of the internet, which is to say everything sort of after the advent of the smartphone, we have this enormous economy now with companies like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Apple, Google, just the litany of tech companies out there who have figured out that you can monetize attention. And what I mean by that is that Cal Newport has this very kind of profound thing he talks about in the very beginning of the book, which is to try to understand the definition of solitude. And it seems like it's getting a little too far afield or abstract. I promise we'll tie it back to music and just...
No, absolutely. Actually, I read it myself, and it's probably my favorite part of the book, so I'm following you completely here.
Wonderful. So he talks about how we define solitude and what that has meant at different points in human history. And he kind of starts off by saying, a lot of people would think naturally about defining solitude as being physically alone, right? Like the classic Thoreau, Walden Pond, sort of go off in the middle of nowhere and just be by yourself.
Yep.
But in the age of the smartphone and ubiquitous Wi-Fi, that's really not enough, because you can be physically by yourself and utterly, perpetually distracted constantly and unable to think straight. By contrast, you can also be in the middle of Times Square in New York City, and if you are, sufficiently focused and concentrating and, wearing earplugs and noise canceling headphones and just you find your own little spot to sit and meditate, you could define that as solitude. And so what he does is define solitude as freedom from input from other human minds. And the combination of that idea, along with the thing he draws our attention to in the book, which is to say that whether you like it or not, whether you've consented to it or not, you are now part of an economy that monetizes your attention. And your attention, your focus and concentration, are an economic quantity that is being basically taken away from you without your knowledge, or oftentimes without your awareness or your consent. And so a lot of the rules he talks about in this book, and pointing back to your question of digital hygiene, are guidelines for how you can start to take that back and how you can establish boundaries of technology for yourself to use the positive parts of it and not fall victim to the negative parts of it. How you can create spaces in your own life to embrace solitude, because I think one of the things, I haven't explicitly written about this yet, and this is not, frankly, when a lot of the people were doing the research on deliberate practice, smartphones didn't even exist yet. And so we're only starting to see how totally destructive these devices are or can be for the solitude that's required for deliberate practice. And I think, any musician worth their salt will recognize immediately that, oh yeah, like it is really impossible to get productive practicing done when you're in a distracted state. Okay. Now couple that with the fact that we live in this new economy where a distracted state is the norm, and actually something that a lot of very sophisticated companies are trying to keep you in all of the time. And you've got a pretty toxic combination. And so it's basically on us to push back in these individual ways and establish good digital hygiene.
Yeah, fair enough. I feel it's even worse for my generation and the generations that followed, because a lot of us are YouTube musicians, and so there is this depth versus breadth problem where you have 1,001 different videos that you can watch that will teach you this and that, but you never have time to it can seem to a young musician that you don't have time to sit and actually practice because there is so much to see and to experience, and maybe you don't know what practice should look like yet. So it can be a very alluring trap. And that was another question I wanted to ask you, actually, that I called Bruce Lee and the 10,000 kicks, because Bruce Lee said that he doesn't fear the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but that he fears the man that has practiced the same kick 10,000 times. So I wanted to ask you, maybe that's a bit extreme, but I wanted to ask you about strategies, practical strategies that one can enact to allocate one's time and attention to, on the one hand, discovering new ideas and taking advantage of the internet, and on the other hand, taking some time alone to practice these ideas and allow them to cross-pollinate with other ideas that one might have.
Yeah, all really good questions. So maybe the best place to start with that is some of the practical guidelines, in a way that Cal Newport talks about. They segue right into how you adapt this for your practicing and how you navigate this problem of depth versus breadth. There's a couple basic ones that he talks about, which is just, right in line with the kinds of things I've written before. Like, don't keep your phone with you in the practice room. Like, it is a device designed for maximum distraction. And even if you follow his guidelines, which I recommend, which is like, take all the apps off of your phone that you don't absolutely need, turn off notifications, all of these general things. The device itself, it still exerts a measurable psychological pull that is distracting you and taking up mental bandwidth. So that's one aspect of it. And I've written about how I encourage students to, take an old phone that's basically dead. It's not connected to the internet. It's not connected to anything. And you can still keep your tuner app on there and your metronome app and all the other useful tools, but absolutely delete and disable everything else. And then, it can be a tool that you use proactively and with intention. And in a way, it's that same sort of mindset of focused intentionality that I think needs to govern the way we interact with the internet and the way we interact with what is essentially infinite content. Because you're right, an individual now, a young musician in the year 2020, has the ability to sit at their laptop or on their phone and peruse YouTube every minute, every waking hour of every day, and they would still have more to learn. And so clearly there has got to be some sort of framework for saying, okay, I'm not going to learn everything. Like that is not possible, nor is it even necessarily beneficial or helpful. I want to learn the things that are relevant to me, to my values, to my process, and ultimately toward the trajectory I want to be defining. And if you actually just sit and write down for yourself what those things mean and what they are, you can start to be a lot better about enforcing and sort of self-policing, so that you don't, spend 3 hours on some deep dive down a rabbit hole where, yeah, you might have watched a bunch of funny videos, but like truly do like hamster singing and 4-part harmony have anything to do with what you're really trying to do to refine your craft, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think also, right. So there's the Bruce Lee idea of, that's the depth part. Like you want to practice something and get really, really good at that thing. Now, of course, it's not, his is a simplified analogy because in music, we don't just have one kind of kick. And obviously in the martial arts, you don't have one kind of kick either. But his point remains that like you decide a thing that you really want to improve and you do that and you try to not get yourself too distracted and pulled away by all the other infinite sort of myriad variations of different mixed martial arts and dancing or in music. I want to learn a new instrument, or I want to learn, how to compose in, 12-tone serialism, or, whatever, right? Like it's a totally endless field. And so at some point you want to decide like, this is kind of my thing. This is what I want to be doing. I think the problem is that can be really difficult, especially now, especially when you are, I'm sort of using the royal youth, the mass of people, possibly young musicians that are out there kind of struggling to find their place and trying to figure out, what is your thing? What is it you want to be doing? And I firmly believe that this is not a process that can be rushed, nor can it be faked. And what I mean by both of those is that I think a lot of people will say, they'll be like 12 or 13 years old and they're like, I know for certain that I want to do X, Y, and Z for the rest of my life. And, as much as I applaud that kind of ambition and self-knowledge, and while it may be true in rare cases, it's usually not, right? Like it's really difficult when you're, in your mid-teens to have the kind of self-knowledge and sort of self-possession that's required to make these kinds of big long-term commitments, right? I certainly wasn't, not remotely. And to a certain extent, I mean, this is actually verging into territory that you didn't exactly ask me about, but it is, I think, related to the range versus, or the depth versus breadth idea. And, that is that it is also, I think, difficult. It's certainly, I know, more this way in Europe than it is in the United States, where you are asked at an early age to basically make these decisions and then stick to it, right? I know a fair amount about the European, especially the Northern European education systems where, you end up taking these tests when you're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 that are sort of deterministic for, okay, well, you're going to be, now you're on this track and now you can't really change tracks, or, okay, you have to decide when you're 14 and you're going to be a musician, or you're going to go to trade school, you're going to go and do, physics or whatever else it is, right?
Yep, and I can also attest to that. Maybe the UK would be the notable exception, but definitely in France and Germany, and especially in Germany, you have that for sure.
Yeah, Scandinavia too, to a certain extent. I'm working with a few students there. And I mean, I don't have a lot to say about that other than I think what we are experiencing is that so you can sort of set up this system where back in the day, and I'm talking about 60, 70 years ago, like pre-computer era, you were, any individual person was exposed to so much less that it was just a lot easier to decide what you wanted to do, right? Like you didn't have this like existential problem of self-discovery and self-determination when if all you knew was, ranching out in eastern Wyoming and that's what your family did and that's what everybody did and that's just what you knew, like it was easy to make that choice. Some would argue that, well, that was not really fair to the people back then because they didn't know what they were missing. And maybe that's true. But I think on the other hand, we're living through almost the paralysis of too many options. And in a way, what the internet affords young people, especially in Europe, is seeing the sort of endless cornucopia of things you can do and be, but you're asked to make decisions about that before you're fully mature, before you're like anywhere near adulthood, and before you have, again, the sort of like emotional maturity to know like what it is that truly interests you and, what you're going to be able to sustain the kind of energy and willpower in for the many, many years it takes to really achieve mastery in a thing. And that's tough. And I think I don't really have a specific prescription for that other than to be aware that that's a problem. And, for myself, the way I dealt with it was that I didn't go to a conservatory, right? Like I needed a liberal arts experience where I could go and get breadth. I wanted that for my education. You mentioned in one of your previous emailed questions, this book Range by Epstein, right?
Yes.
And I think it's interesting because some people point to that work and point to his book and some of the statements in there, and it's tempting to sort of say, well, no, this is a complete, repudiation of the idea of deliberate practice. You shouldn't focus on something. What you need is range and breadth. And I read all that, and I was reading about the book and what he wrote in it, and I was like, wait a minute, no, not at all. These things are not mutually exclusive. They're not antagonistic at all. Like, I think what it is chronological. For me, and I think for many people, breadth precedes depth, which is to say, you get exposed to a lot, you learn about a lot of different things. This helps inform your worldview and make connections among different ideas and different disciplines. And armed with that, and then comparing it to your own sort of sense of identity and your values and what you see that you want to contribute, you start to make decisions about what it is you're going to go really deep on. And I think that regardless of the educational system you're in, regardless of Europe versus US, regardless of liberal arts versus conservatory, there is this basic dynamic that can helpfully and sort of healthily exist, which is to say, breadth precedes depth. Don't rush to depth if you're not sure about it, right? I think the consequences of that, we see them all the time, right? Like, especially in the US, our American orchestras have people in them where, they had parents that were really, really pushing their kids to go into music, and basically from the age of 5 or 6, saying, okay, this is what you're going to do. This is what our family does. You're going to be a musician too. You need to go practice and do all this. And with sufficient sort of tyrannical helicopter parenting, like, you can force a kid to get really good at an instrument, like good enough to win a job. That certainly happens. I think the problem is that we also see it's not very sustainable, because people get in there and they realize, like, wait a minute, I didn't ever want to do this in the first place. And then, they're adults on their own, and they have landed in a place that they didn't get to through their own volition or without sort of defining their own agency in the process. And then things can get really complicated. And I think that's why you see certain examples of, people.
Crisis.
Yeah, sort of, maybe a midlife crisis, maybe an early life crisis, but anything where they're like, oh my God, forget all of this, I'm dropping everything and going back to do something completely different. And and it's also, in a way, it's ironic for me to say this, because I think some people that don't know me or don't know like the context of my story would say, well, wasn't that what you did? Like, you went into this one field and you totally jumped and did the other thing. And my answer to that is actually no. It was much more linear and sort of seamless than that. Like, I pretty early on in the process, I knew what it was that I wanted to be doing. I knew what it was that sort of my values and my process were urging me to do. And then it was just a matter of actualizing it. And then that takes time. And the only sort of exceptional difference was that I managed to have a day job, right? All musicians get to a point where they're out of school and they have to pay the rent somehow. It's just that mine happened to be at a nanotech company and not like Starbucks. But yeah. but my sort of my guiding principle remained the same, which was I want to do this if I can. And there wasn't crisis involved in that.